Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the ICG's Digital Academy webinar series. This is Sally Alsop, a member of the ICG committee and responsible for running our webinar programme. In today's webinar, you'll be hearing from Kim Smouter, who is ESOMAR's Head of Public Affairs and Professional Standards. Kim joined ESOMAR in 2012 and now heads up a small team of professional standards and public affairs experts championing the value of market, opinion and social research and data analytics. He also works to promote the interests of ESOMAR members and the broader sector, leading ESOMAR's advocacy efforts on major policy dossiers, including the GDPR and the e-privacy regulation. This morning, Kim will be talking us through his experience of the common mistakes market researchers make when it comes to GDPR and how they can best navigate it going forwards. I'm happy to say that Kim has agreed to take questions at the end, so please type them in the question box as usual as we go through, and Lucy will be reading them out during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. We are really grateful to FieldSource for sponsoring this webinar. FieldSource, who are members of the ICG, know that clients don't need suppliers, they need partners. They believe in a partnership approach and strive to create bespoke solutions for every study, ensuring that their clients are able to take on any challenge that comes their way. They cover focus groups, IDIs, ethnography, online communities, mobile communities, online surveys, passive data collection, central location testing and home product testing. So showing on your screen, and before I hand over to Kim, here are the next webinars to note in your diaries. They're all open for registration now. Also, there are still sponsorship opportunities for a couple of forthcoming webinars if anyone is interested. This costs £100 for a lot of exposure on our website, mailers and through social media, and of course on the day. So our speaker today is Kim Smouter from ESOMAR, and I shall now hand over to Kim.
Hello everyone, can you hear me?
That's great, we can hear you loud and clear. Thanks, Kim.
Perfect. And can you see the slides as well?
Yep, we can see the slides.
Perfect. Let me put them in full screen. Hi everyone. So thank you very much, ICG, for the opportunity to be speaking to you today. I hope to, through this presentation, in essence, to kind of give you a good refresher with regards to the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, and hopefully through this presentation, you'll be refreshed in terms of some of the key principles to think about. But also I want to kind of use the experience of the fact that this particular piece of legislation is now 2 years on to talk a little bit about the things where we see the research committee as having particular pain points which are worthwhile looking at more closely in order to ensure that we don't face regulatory enforcement against us. So thank you so much for all of you for being here today. I thought I would begin this presentation because GDPR is always, a very dry topic, to kind of talk a little bit about myself first in order to give it a little bit more color, just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from and the perspective I'm trying to bring to this particular discussion. I've been working in Brussels since 2004 in public affairs. So in fact, my background isn't research, but it is very much understanding kind of regulators, understanding the law, understanding the European infrastructure and those types of things. So I've been working in the European Parliament. I've been working for the British government before arriving at ESOMAR. I've accompanied the GDPR essentially from the first time it was talked about, so when it was being first negotiated, all the way to implementation. And of course, through ESOMAR, we've also been developing a lot of support programs for our members to be able to understand how GDPR should be best implemented. So that's kind of the background and my experience I have with GDPR. For quite a long while, it was the bane of my existence. And I would have to say that my inbox was only about GDPR. I'm glad to say 2 years on, it's a little bit less about GDPR, even though it still retains a lot of attention for many of us because of how much personal data and data is as an ingredient for our sector. I just wanted to also highlight that, of course, I do things outside of GDPR. I'm an avid cyclist, and I'm also a science fiction fan. I write novels about science fiction, and of course, I follow that quite a bit. So I am a full person as well. So if you want to talk about those things, of course, feel free to ask them in the questions. Before we go into the dry subject, I just thought it'd be an interesting segue before we begin. So what I want to do in this presentation is maybe take us back a little bit with regards to GDPR, because many people have kind of this massive fear about GDPR and kind of forget that actually a lot of the principles and the requirements which stem from GDPR actually were already in place within the European Union through the EU Data Protection Directive, which was enforced since 1995. And in fact, what GDPR essentially does was to update that data protection directive and bring it to the 21st century. So in 2012, essentially when I first joined ESOMAR, there was a decision by the European institutions to update the regulatory framework governing data protection and privacy. As we've seen, 1995, 2012, a lot of things changed with regards to the internet. All of us became, social media users. Those types of things had not been anticipated in 1995, and therefore there was a need to very much update this framework. There was a huge amount of lobbying and negotiations between 2012 and 2016. The GDPR was probably the most heavily lobbied piece of legislation the European Union ever adopted. And I think you see that reflection in terms of how the law came into about. And its entry into force on 2018, of course, meant that the regulatory framework for the EU changed quite drastically. And how did we all come to contact with GDPR? Well, it was probably through this tsunami of consent requests that we all received. So if you think about it, there was, when GDPR came into about, there was a huge amount of fear with regards to enforcement. There was a lot of talk about the fines, the fact that it was now possible to have, up to 2% of your annual global turnover. And so for big companies like Google and others, that meant billions of euros of potential fines if you were to violate GDPR. For smaller organizations, it was also a huge amount, so 20 million euros potentially in fines if you weren't going to comply with the law. There was also a huge amount of misinformation about what you could or couldn't do within GDPR. And there was, of course, this idea that you had to re-secure consent from everyone. So I think all of us were, when GDPR came into force, hammered by mail after email after email after email asking us to have consent for newsletter descriptions. And actually, I call it a debacle because most of that was not necessary. It was not required by the GDPR, but because of that misinformation and because of that fear, we all received all of these laws. As a result of that, the good news, I guess, for the EU is that GDPR awareness is extremely high. In a survey which was conducted by the European Union last year, 69% of Europeans claim to know about the law, 71% claim to know about their national data protection authority. As far as European laws are concerned, this is extremely high awareness. And also, as a result of that, there's a huge amount of understanding that people do have rights under the GDPR. And as a result of that, tens of thousands of complaints have been lodged through DPAs against companies with regards to GDPR implementation. So within 2 years already, we see that this law has attracted a lot of attention. It has attracted a lot of awareness, but there is still quite a lot of misunderstanding with regards to what you can and cannot do within this particular legislation. I want to take a step back to regards to GDPR and what the objectives are with regards to this law. The EU's objectives when they adopted the GDPR was first and foremost to provide a clear framework to foster a digital single market. So this is one of the important things to remember about GDPR. The GDPR isn't there to prevent you from collecting or using or processing personal data for research purposes. The aim of the GDPR is to enable that to happen. And in fact, the objective of the EU was to create a safe space for the collection and the use of personal data within the European market, but also to simplify lots of things in order to ensure that companies could actually operate within what they're calling the digital single market. The other aspect and the other objective of the EU was very much to shift the burden of accountability to data controllers. And that sounds like a horrible thing when I say it. But the intention wasn't actually through that shift of accountability to create additional burdens. The idea was that data controllers should be free to decide what was the most appropriate mechanisms to put in place to protect personal data, and that freedom of choice should be left to the data controllers, to the companies which are collecting personal data. In exchange for that, they are accountable for ensuring the safety of that data. And we'll talk a lot about that in this presentation. But the idea here wasn't to create more burden to companies. The idea here was to enable more flexibility for companies to be able to innovate within this digital single market. As a counterpoint to that increased freedom was this idea of also strengthening the ability of data subjects to exert control over their personal data. There was a real feeling in the negotiations that essentially data subjects no longer had control over their personal data, that data controllers were doing everything and anything with personal data, and there was no way for the data subject to exert control back and to put limitations on information collected about them and used potentially against them. So there was a real sense from the EU that they wanted to strengthen the ability of data subjects to exert that control. Linked to that was also the decision to sharpen data protection authorities' ability to impose dissuasive sanctions. And to give you a sense, back in the 1995 directive, some data protection authorities were able to issue fines of maximum 10,000 euros. So of course, when you're pointing to Google and talking about you violated a data protection law, here's a 10,000 euro fine, that's not very dissuasive for a company like Google, who have who make more than enough money. 10,000 euros is probably 1 microsecond of their business life. So these were essentially the objectives of the GDPR. So I hope that you're hearing through this presentation already that GDPR isn't meant to be a showstopper. Its aim is really to enable you to make the best use of personal data, but it also imposes a certain approach which is called a risk-based approach. So essentially that you identify what are the potential risks for collecting personal data, and it also imposes the accountability of those who collect and use personal data to ensure that safety. One of the things which GDPR is also quite important to highlight is that it's not a tick box exercise. Compliance with GDPR entails embedding data protection questions into the essence of how you do business, into the essence of how you conduct research or something else. So it's very much, on the one hand, you have quite a lot of flexibility within GDPR, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But on the other hand, you also have responsibility of protection and of safeguarding against particular risks. So that's kind of the aspects. And in implementing GDPR and in implementing those safeguards, you realize very quickly that GDPR touches on everything that you do. And as a result of that, it's really difficult to just say, GDPR compliance is just a tick box exercise of having a privacy policy, having the right consent statements, and then forgetting about it. That's not how GDPR compliance works. So what I'm going to do in this presentation is really to update you a little bit with regards to how data protection authorities are enforcing GDPR. And through that enforcement actions, you can kind of see already what are the common mistakes that not just research companies, but indeed all companies are making with regards to the implementation of GDPR. Through that, I'm going to highlight those common mistakes and talk a little bit about how we can potentially overcome them. Through these kinds of case examples, I'll therefore underscore also what to focus on. So if you have limited resources, as most of us do, limited resources, whether it be human resources or financial resources, what should you be focusing on in order to prevent you from, appearing on a data protection authority's radar? And last but not least, I'll talk a little bit about this concept that we at ESOMAR have coined, the data counseling concept, which is very much about how do you approach GDPR holistically as an organization so that you make the most of your personal data assets, but at the same time, safeguard against the risks which we've identified and we've talked about in the presentation. So I hope that that gives you a bit of structure with regards to what I'm going to be doing. So let's talk a little bit about enforcement. GDPR has slowly but surely, left the spotlight. In 2018, it was like all hands on deck. GDPR was going to change the world. It's the end of the world. We won't be able to do anything with data. That was kind of the messaging which was coming out in 2018. And clearly we are in 2020 and data is still being collected. It is still being used. Companies are still making money off of personal data. So the world hasn't collapsed with regards to data protection and privacy. It might have collapsed in other aspects, unfortunately, but with regards to this, there hasn't been a huge, fundamental shift, or at least not as tectonic as we were expecting. Nonetheless, enforcement actions are increasing quite a bit and quite significantly since the last few years. In 2020, I've seen a huge spike in enforcement actions. Since the entry into force, over 490 million euros worth of fines have been levied. This 340 fines have been issued on GDPR non-compliance, and March 2020 was the highest number of fines for this year, and compared to the year before, it's almost a doubling of the number of enforcement actions. So the data protection authorities are being very busy. They've also been very overwhelmed by the number of complaints that they've received. So I think what we can see is that this enforcement, this increasing in enforcement, will continue as the months and years go by, and that actually there's still quite a lot of in the caseloads within the data protection authorities which are going to give us food for thought. So I wanted to also talk a little bit about what exactly the data protection authorities are focusing on. So what are the top reasons justifying sanctions in terms of values? If you split that previous number out, essentially there are three kind of three themes which are coming out again and again. The first one, and the one which is accounting for the most value in terms of the value of fines, is essentially insufficient information security. So it's things like passwords are not sufficiently protected, or things like files are being shared without any protection whatsoever, or a cell phone has been left behind in a metro. It hasn't been secured and you haven't been able to erase it. Or it can be things like your databases have been hacked. So it's those kinds of things which would fall within the insufficient information security bracket. And here you see 335 million euros worth of fines issued. And one of the reasons why this value is so high is that very often the hacks are targeting very big companies. The second aspect, which is really important to think about, is insufficient legal basis. So this accounts for 128 million euros worth of fines. And what we mean by insufficient legal base is essentially that in GDPR, you have 6 different legal bases that you could potentially use. And it's not so much that you can pick and choose which one you use, but they have to essentially reflect what your processing activity is about and the context in which that processing is taking place. So I'll talk more about this particular point later in the presentation. So I'm not going to go into too much detail right now. The last but not least is non-compliance with GDPR principles. And what are GDPR principles? Well, it's principles like data minimization, or the collection of only what you need for the purposes that you need. It's things like, the data subjects have rights, and that those rights are promoted and not abused by the controllers. So it's those types of things which account for non-compliance with GDPR principles. So as you can see here, the most value, insufficient information security, the least non-compliance with GDPR principles, with legal basis kind of in between. But these are the kinds of things which have clearly focused a lot of attention from the data protection authorities and where the fines have been most issued from. I want to give you a flip concept to understand that whilst the value is different, actually if you look at the volume, so the number of fines, there's actually a slightly different running order. And this is why it was quite interesting for us to give you this information, so that actually the most times Data Protection Authority has issued fines has been on insufficient legal basis. They account for about 145 of that 300 plus fines which have been issued, 340. If you look then at the rest of the sanctions, information security comes second, and non-compliance with GDPR principles comes third. So you have a flip in which one comes first, and so it highlights that again, whilst information security is creating the most kind of the big headline fines, insufficient legal basis is the one which is creating the most volumes in terms of the number of fines. So it's really important to not think that one or the other is really something to be focused on. It's clearly all three aspects which are being looked at by the data protection authorities. The other thing I want to highlight is who the fines have been issued to. A huge majority of these have, of course, targeted the large brands and government agencies. So it could be like hospitals, or it can be ministries. Brands like Facebook and Google have been prime targets, but also airlines and also hotel and catering services as well. They've also been issued to SMEs and also to charities. So it hasn't just been large brands and governments facing that. And I wanted to highlight as well that actually also a couple of individuals have also been fined under GDPR. Just to give you a small idea about what the individuals were fined for. One of them was fined because they had placed video cameras in shower rooms and had been recording without the consent of the individuals concerned. And the other one was because of a YouTube channel which had failed to remove certain personal data. In this case, it was a YouTube channel which was essentially looking at kind of, there was kind of like the dash cam channels, and that particular channel was showing the license plates of certain cars, and that was seen to be a GDPR violation. So it highlights the kind of the breadth of topics which are being covered by data protection authorities and the kind of things you have to watch out for, and also the fact that very often these fines are issued for very mundane mistakes. And that's really important to note, that it's not massive massive failures of systems which are being fined for. It's very often mistakes like everybody having access to the database, or everybody having access to all the files, or as in the case of this YouTube channel, the fact that they forgot to mask the license plate number, and therefore the information was identifiable. So I hope that gives you kind of a sense of the kinds of things which people are making mistakes on, and I suspect that those of us in the research community will recognize that some of those are probably things that we do on a day-to-day basis without even thinking about it. So 2 years on, GDPR is now well embedded within the organization, but still very many companies are feeling that they are not GDPR compliant, that they're not actually ready, that they don't actually understand what all the GDPR requirements are. And that's fairly normal, but it highlights also the aspect that potentially it's worthwhile checking in with your chain, checking in with your partners to see how they feel about GDPR. Do they feel that they know everything they have to do? Are our contracts still fit for purpose? Have we covered all our bases? That's really important to do, especially 2 years on, because you should be doing this anyway on an annual basis. So just double check with your chain, is everyone still okay? Is everyone still feeling that they are compliant with GDPR? Have there been any mistakes? Have there been things that we can improve on? That's something which, with regards to GDPR, we should always be doing. So I wanted to kind of pull out a couple of questions which we commonly get within ESOMAR. ESOMAR, since GDPR, has a service we call ESOMAR Plus, and we also have our query service, which is open to members. And essentially, people can submit questions with regards to GDPR, and we basically use them to inform our guidance, and of course to provide one-to-one support for our members. And questions we often get are things like, do I really have to name my client? Or how do I secure consent, really? Or can I and how should I share data with partners? Or can I move data abroad? And here I want to kind of give a small parentheses to a recent ruling called the Schrems 2 ruling, which involves a complaint by privacy advocate Max Schrems, who was complaining that the Privacy Shield, so the data transfer agreement which enables transfers of data between the US and Europe, was non-compliant with GDPR, and the European Court of Justice has agreed with him and has struck down the Privacy Shield. The European institutions are negotiating with the US how to solve this problem, but it highlights that we are again back kind of where we were almost 2 years ago, where data transfers between the US and Europe are once again problematic because transfer mechanisms have been struck down and you're forced to go back to other mechanisms to make that happen. If you have specific questions about this, I'm not planning to cover this in this presentation, but if you have specific questions, feel free to submit them in the questions box and I can go into a bit more detail about that. But essentially, this is one of the things which I definitely take out from this presentation, that if you do have partners or if you are working with US based partners, do have a look at that and do check out the Schrems 2 ruling, because it might have an impact in terms of how you operate with regards to that. I'll try to answer these kind of 3 key questions in the presentation. If I don't, or if you still have questions with regards to that, feel free to ask them. So before we begin, I want to kind of talk a little bit about the life cycle of what I would say is a good life cycle for GDPR compliant processing. The first thing to think about, regardless of what you're doing, if you're going to be processing personal data, one of the important questions you have to ask yourself and with regards to your entire data chain is, who is controlling the means and the purpose for that collection of personal data? Because that determines who you are within GDPR. Are you a controller? Are you a processor? Are you a third party? And these answers fundamentally impact how much liability you have within GDPR, how much room for flexibility you have, who is responsible for what, if something goes wrong, who has to talk to the data subject, who has to talk to the data protection authority. All of these things essentially rest upon answering that question of who is controlling the means and the purpose of collecting personal data. And that's actually one place where lots of people make lots of mistakes. So we'll talk a little bit about that. The other aspect is essentially, what is your legal basis to collect that data? So you're going to collect personal data, but are you lawfully collecting that data, and under what basis? And here you have 6 different options essentially. One is consent, which a lot of people love to use, but I'll talk a little bit about why that might not necessarily be the right one to use. Legitimate interest, contract, a legal requirement imposed by law, a public interest, or a vital interest. And it's really important to pick the right legal base. And that legal base isn't, just a free choice. It is based on the context of that processing activity. So I'll give you an example. If you are collecting personal data and your client is, for example, the Ministry of Justice, and the Ministry of Justice wants to understand, the prevalence of crime in a particular region, you wouldn't use consent as your legal base. You would be using public interest as your legal base, because the Ministry of Justice is actually acting on behalf of the public interest. And as a result of that, that legal base should be public interest and shouldn't be consent. Consent should actually be a legal basis of final resort if you can't use any of the other legal bases. Legitimate interest is also an interesting one, particularly for marketing purposes. So all of these things have to be considered very carefully. The last aspect, which I would say is really important, is what are you collecting? So what pieces of personal data are you collecting, and why? Are you really going to use it? If you're not, you shouldn't be collecting it, and otherwise it's not GDPR compliant. So here we're talking about things like what kind of personal data you're collecting, the categories of that, the intended end use, the transfer outside the EU or to other partners. All of these types of things are really important questions to resolve within GDPR compliant processing. And clearly, the reason I'm mentioning that is that very often these are the places where we're not giving sufficient thought, and therefore creating mistakes, and therefore creating potential for data protection authority to come knocking on our doors to issue us a very lovely but undesired fine. So I'm now going to go into more detail about where I think mistakes happen a lot. The first one, I think, is getting your role and responsibility wrong in the data chain. So we know that as for small research agencies, you use a lot of different partners to make the research magic happen. You have your clients, you have potentially other partners which are helping with the processing, with the storage, with all of the information. And so we have very complex data chains, and it's very complicated to, on the basis of the binary options that are offered by the GDPR, to actually understand who is really responsible for what. So, but the reason why it's really important is that everything flows from that decision. So you have processor, the person who is actually controlling the purposes and the means. You have a controller, the controller is that particular person. The processor acts on the instructions of the controller, and the controller is the one which determines the purposes and the means by which the processing is going to happen. You already might hear from what I've just explained that it's really difficult for an agency to be a processor if they're the ones making decisions about certain things. There's also a concept of the third party, so a group which is sitting outside the processor versus controller relationship, which in itself is authorized to have access to the personal data. What I hope you hear here is that the role of controller might not be determined solely by who is paying, even though you might be asked to do that. So you might see contracts where you're imposed, because we are paying, therefore we are the controller. And I want to highlight that one of the common mistakes we make is to blankly accept that. And that isn't the way we should be approaching it. The way you have to approach the processor-controller relationship is who has access to personal data? Who is controlling that relationship? Who determines when that information is deleted or not? Who is determining where this information goes and isn't going? Those are the kinds of questions that if you actually are the ones responding to that, then you may be a controller, but you may also be a joint controller. So that is something which is really important. Getting the role and responsibility wrong also then has impact, because if you misidentified yourself as a processor, then therefore you are also not complying with certain requirements to transparency, to notification, those types of things. So that's why this is really important. If you get this wrong, most likely the rest of your GDPR compliance is going to be wrong as well. The other thing which many people get wrong, therefore, is also getting your legal base mixed up. So as I mentioned, you have 6 different options. And also I want to highlight that GDPR consent does not mean consent, does not mean permission. GDPR consent has some very strict requirements. It has things like you have to inform individuals about what you're collecting, why you're collecting it, how long you're retaining it for, who is it being shared with, where is it being shared to, is it moving outside the country, those types of things. If you're not asking all of these questions, you're not informing the data subject when you're collecting consent, then you don't have GDPR consent. You might have permission to do something, but it might not be GDPR consent. So that's something which is really important to remember. GDPR consent isn't consent the way we all understand it in the normal world. In the normal world, we would say, I've asked you for permission. Do you give me permission? Yes. Okay, I have consent. I can move forward. In GDPR, it's a bit more complex and more nuanced than that. It has to be informed. It has to be affirmative. It has to be demonstrated. It has to be recorded. So that's really important. When you're using consent, be mindful that consent is a particular type of consent under the law, and that there's a lot of requirements linked to it. Therefore, it might be more interesting to look at legitimate interest as another potential source of lawful processing. Legitimate interest is more flexible than consent in some ways. You don't have quite the same requirements to inform the data subject in the same way. However, the reason why many people don't like to use legitimate interest is because you have to create a balance of interest test. So you have to ask yourself, is the information that I'm collecting legitimate for my business uses? And is it going to be infringing on the rights of the data subject? So that test is really difficult for many people to answer, but you have more flexibility as a result of it. Again, you might have contract and legal obligations, public interest and vital interest as potential other sources of lawful processing. And again, it's not quite your choice. It's not a free choice as to which one you use. It has to be linked to the context in which you're processing. In the same way that the processor versus controller question is determined on the actual context of processing, not on who is paying and who isn't paying. The other thing which I would say is a key kind of retention, is kind of a key place where we make mistakes, is on the whole question around retention and around reuse and around sharing. When you're collecting personal data, the idea is that you should have a stated purpose for that collection, and that it also should be a finite duration in which you keep the information, and when you don't need it, you have to either erase that information and take it off, or you have to anonymize it. And we all know that in the research, actually, the idea is to try to keep the information as long as possible, because you never know. There might be something interesting in that personal data set that you wouldn't know until 3 or 4 years down the line, and therefore it's really fun to keep it. But under GDPR, you only retain the information for a stated purpose. So that's really important. One of the things which GDPR tried to do is to create a legal framework which took into account the fact that we are reusing data, that we are using it for big data use cases and those types of things. And GDPR was designed with the intention of enabling that to happen, of enabling big data use cases, of enabling reuse of that information. And so therefore, actually within the GDPR, there is scope for reusing personal data for what is called a compatible purpose. So in the other piece of good news is that in the lobbying that we did, we also secured that for research purposes, that compatibility is always assumed to be the case. So if you have collected, for example, a customer database and you want to reuse that customer database for a research purpose, you don't need to resecure consent because you have a compatible purpose. And that compatible purpose therefore enables you to reuse the information for a research purpose. The other thing which is really important is around international data transfers. In GDPR world, we are no longer allowed to move data to every single country in the world without doing some due diligence. That is the case, as I mentioned, in the US with the Schrems 2 case. Therefore, you have to use certain contractual clauses, or you have to inform the data subject that you're moving the information to that particular country. Those types of things have to be accounted for. International data transfers are really tricky. And most of the time when you're doing an international research project, you're probably doing both international research within the EU and outside the EU, and this is quite a painful exercise. So it also goes back to my point with regards to processor versus controller. The effort with regards to determining how to make an international data transfer work, the onus is on the controller to determine that. In the same way that for retention, the onus is on the controller to ensure that the stated purpose is maintained, that the finite duration is actually came, that the processors which are working on the instructions of the controller are erasing it in the right way. So all of those things the onus is on the controller to ensure, but these are things which, again, we see a lot of mistakes being done by different research agencies with regards to the retention, the reuse, and the sharing, and how to make that happen. The other thing, I think you've seen it in the fines, neglecting data security, so not being up to date. And I think there's kind of probably 3 reasons for that. I think one of them is clearly, do we have the right competence to create the right data security framework, which is fully up to date and all those types of things. And that's really, that's a difficult one, to making sure that you get the right competence in play, to be able to ensure that our data security systems are up to speed, are up to date, are really effective with regards to the kind of risks that we're exposing this personal data set that we're building. I think the other aspect is with regards to accessibility. We all want, tools which are easy to use, which don't get in our way. and that ease of use has a cost with regards to data security. We know that the most secure systems are the ones which ask us for 3 passwords, or the ones which ask us for 2-form authentication, those types of things, which are a real pain. But at the same time, they're really important to ensure that you don't get hit with the breaches and don't have to contact the data protection authority. And I think, let's all be honest, there is a certain laziness aspect to it. It's really horrible to have to remember a new password every single week in order to maintain the security. So it's much easier to have a password which looks always the same. Those types of things are unfortunately things which create which create a problem with regards to data security, and which lead to all of these data breaches. The other aspect, I think, which a lot of agencies aren't doing enough of, is to actually stress test your systems so that you can identify, when there is a data breach, are you ready to react to it? Noting that within GDPR, you only have 72 hours to react to a data breach, to notify the right people, to provide the information to the Data Protection Authority. Those things have to happen within 72 hours. And it doesn't matter if that happens on a Sunday. It doesn't matter if that happens on a Saturday. It has to be done within 72 hours. So in order to make that happen, to be prepared, it's important to do, like fire drills, like health drills, you need to have a data breach drill once in a while to make sure that you're prepared for the data breach and that everybody within your small team are aware of what they have to do. Remember that GDPR gave us the flexibility to make lots of choices. So there isn't an imposed decision as to processor versus controller. There isn't an imposed decision with regards to legal basis, with regards to how long you can retain, with regards to the tools that you use. But it does mean that the person who is collecting the personal data has to ensure its safety as well. So that's kind of the quid pro quo, so to speak, with regards to this. The other thing which I think is a piece of work which is difficult, and it goes back to kind of our laziness topic, which I was just raising before, and that's the record keeping and the due diligence. Remember that for all your processing activities, you need to have a data register which captures what you are doing. So that data register should say that you have a research project. As part of that research project, you're collecting names, you're collecting telephone numbers, you're collecting video recordings of those people. That information is being stored where? Who has access to it? That register has to be kept up to date all the time. So, if you haven't touched your data register in a while, please use this webinar as a reminder to double check and make sure that the register is reflecting all of your processing activities. The other thing which perhaps you're not doing enough of are data protection impact assessments. So if you're collecting, very sensitive information, so it could be things like, political orientations, or it could be, sexual orientation, or it can be health information, those types of things. If you're going to be using that in research, those potentially can create a high risk for the data subjects. And when you do those particular projects, you're supposed to carry out what's known as a data protection impact assessment. And there are some key questions essentially that you have to pose yourself to identify what the risks might be for collecting that information. What would happen if somebody were to, for example, breach your databases and steal the information, release it out in the wild? What would be the risk to the data subjects? And based on those identified risks, you have to put measures to mitigate against that risk. And if you can't find measures that can mitigate against the risk, then potentially you shouldn't be doing the data processing at all. So it's those types of things which you need to be mindful of. I think also it's really important, like I've mentioned, to continuously doing audits and system health checks, to double check your privacy policies, to double check the information you're providing to the data subjects to make sure that it is up to date and reflects your current practices. Don't let these things go out of date, because potentially the Data Protection Authority can be knocking on your door, and you always need to be ready to prove that you've done your homework, that you've kept it up to date. That's really one of the important aspects, and one of the things I really want to highlight with the GDPR. It's a continuous activity. The other thing which I think many people don't do enough of is the future proofing. So what I mean by that is that you need to build in certain flexibility within your research projects. You need to anticipate future needs, you need to anticipate use cases, and you should always review the pertinence of protection measures. The more you anticipate, so the more you think about, okay, I'm doing this particular project now, but if things go well, maybe in 3 years down the line, I will actually want to reuse the information I've collected for that particular project in order to spearhead new projects. If you already think about that, you can already then communicate that to the data subjects in a transparent way that you're anticipating those use cases. And the more you anticipate, well, guess what? The more GDPR will allow you to do certain things. I want to kind of close with perhaps what is most important of all, and to remember that GDPR is a rights-based approach to personal data use. So the idea was very much to reinforce the rights of data subjects to maintain control over their personal data. So therefore, one of the key focuses and one of the places where we get a lot wrong is also the communication with the data subject. I would say there are 4 things to remember. Be very transparent about data collection. Have communication ready when things go wrong. Also, the accessibility of materials to secure informed consent, and the treatment of data subject requests. That has to be very quick. And I would say, kind of my golden rules with regards to this is that whenever you are communicating to data subjects, avoid legalese. Be creative. It's something which data protection authorities really value, is those organizations which take that extra effort to be very creative and to be very clear and concise about the information they provide to data subjects. But it also has to be very comprehensive. GDPR imposes upon you, when you're communicating with data subjects, a certain amount of information has to be provided, which goes back to the point about being creative. It's a difficult balancing act between being comprehensive on the one hand, but still being clear, concise, and creative. And I understand that that's a really difficult challenge, but it's one which GDPR imposes upon us, but which many organizations have been doing very, very effectively by using videos or using infographics or presenting it in a different way, in a storytelling kind of way. Those types of things are things which are absolutely legal within GDPR, but you have to make sure that you cover all the grounds and all the basics. I know the time is ticking, and you might be kind of going, having heard me going like, but didn't you say that this wasn't a showstopper? Yeah, it isn't a showstopper because you can do pretty much anything that you were doing before and that you want to do moving forward, but it does mean changing how we approach our data assets and how we approach the use of them. And that's what GDPR imposes upon us. So if you want to kind of understand how to create a balanced kind of strategy with regards to your data collection, I want to kind of highlight a white paper that we authored about a year ago, which is kind of a white paper around a smart data strategy. And it talked very much about essentially how to be responsible in terms of data collection and use, and also with regards to how to be a data-driven organization, as well as how to maintain kind of the ethical aspect of it. So I want to, you can kind of get this white paper at esomar.org/smart-data-lab. And that white paper kind of captures a little bit everything that I've talked about, but in a bit more detail. And I think it can be quite helpful for small organizations to really use it as a guiding tool with regards to how GDPR compliance frameworks can be established in your particular context. For me, I think it kind of as closing remarks, GDPR very much requires you to understand and to know every personal data coming into the organization and every personal data piece going out of the organization and who it's going out to. You can't comply if you don't know your flows. So it's really important to look back at that, to use your data register to make sure that it captures everything in order to understand where the potential risks might be and where you might potentially beef up security or communication or whatever. But it's really important to get that right. So I hope through this presentation to have given you a sense of where the common mistakes are coming from, what are the things to focus on, and hopefully there are lots of questions where we can enable us to really go into more detail with regards to specific use cases and those types of things. So thank you so much for your attention. I've left on the slide here the contact details that you can use if you have any particular follow-up questions that you want us to look into. I'm also highlighting that we have a GDPR resources page, which has past webinars that we've run on the topic, guidance notes and documents, which could be particularly useful for you. That's esomar.org/GDPR. I think you'll find a wealth of information if this is still new to you, or if there are still questions or concerns. But thank you so much for your attention. And I guess the floor is back to ICG.
Thank you. Thank you, Kim. That was excellent. This is Lucy here. I've got the questions. Is there a standard template available online to undertake a data protection impact assessment?
ESOMAR has one. So I would say if you're interested in that, just get in touch with me and one of my colleagues can send that over to you.
Okay. Brilliant. And another question, do ESOMAR have some standard recommendations, templates, suggestions for GDPR compliant introductions for surveys?
We don't. And the reason for that is because it depends a little, the information you have to provide depends very much on whether you're a processor or a controller. And that is determined very much by, I would say, kind of as an easy way to understand it, essentially it's how much control does one party exert over the processing activity. So if the agency has been very heavily involved in the design of the survey in terms of who is going to get the survey, what it's going to be used for, and those types of things, and the client has very little role, it might be actually that the client doesn't have much to say, but you have to inform a lot of things about what you as the agency does. But it could be the other way around. So if the client has a lot of things to say and is only essentially using the agency as a processor or a processing partner, then actually it's not the agency which has to provide that information, but it's the client that's provided information. So that's why it's very difficult to have a very standardized kind of text to use to collect consent. One of the things which we are working on at ESOMAR together with national associations here in Europe is to develop a GDPR code of conduct, which would help to answer some of those questions and provide a bit more standardization, reviewed and checked by the data protection authorities. So I'm hoping kind of, by towards the year end, beginning of next year, I might actually be able to answer that question by saying, actually, yes, we do have certain documents you can use at least as templates.
Okay, thank you. I have a question from me. Can an organisation be checked or audited for compliance just because randomly, or does a complaint have to be made in order to be checked?
It can be spot checked, and it depends a little bit on each data protection authority. So what we've seen, clearly, yeah, if there's a complaint, the chances of being contacted by a data protection authority is likely to happen. What we've also seen is that data protection authorities have conducted spot checks. So, for example, they might say, we've seen there's 15 complaints about the fact that that consent documents are incorrect, or the privacy policy does not provide all the information. So what they will do is say, well, we're going to take 100 random companies from our turf, and we're going to basically spot check. So we're going to see, are they complying, are they not complying? And if they're not, then we're going to issue either recommendations or potentially fines. So that we've seen, for example, the Dutch DPA has been doing that quite a bit. Other DPAs have different approach where they say, they will pre-announce, in essence, we're going to be looking at X, Y, and Z. We expect companies by X date to have these things sorted. If we haven't, then we will be enforcing. So there's very different enforcement strategies coming around across Europe. And it perhaps highlights that it's important to maintain a good relationship, a working relationship with your data protection authority. So I think it's sometimes, it's sometimes good to just give them a call or give them a shout and to say, hey, we'd love to talk to you about our company and what we do. We'd love to present to you the kind of stuff so that we have a working relationship. Some data protection authorities welcome that. And it's also a really great way to avoid going down the route of, we don't know who you are, we see that you're doing a lot of stuff, you've collected a lot of personal data, we disagree with this, here's the fine. If you already have had a previous relationship with them, it's much more of a, it'll be much more of a positive construction relationship, so to speak. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer to your simple question. Sorry.
Thank you. No, but really helpful. This is, I think I can answer it, but very helpful webinar. Thank you, Kim. Will the slides recording be available later? And I think the answer is yes. I'll put that up on the ICG website within the next couple of days. So that's that. If there are any more, we don't have actually any more questions. But just saying to attendees, if you've got anything now, type it into your question box so that we can read it out. And very kindly, Kim has said, if you have later questions, you can address them to him if anything strikes you after the webinar. Last chance, I think we are done. I just checked the chat box in case anybody's written anything in there. No, I think we are done. That's really, really helpful. So thank you so much, Kim. Extremely helpful. I'm sure people will go back to it and listen again, because there was a lot of stuff in there. So thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. And indeed, if there are any additional questions, professional.standards@esomar.org, and my colleagues will endeavor to respond to them as quickly as they can.
Brilliant. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.